introduced, I am Crawford. I work at Bloomberg as a technical trader. So I've been at Bloomberg about 3.5 years in that role, and before that, I was a computer science professor at a small private university in Florida. No, not that. Whatever one you're thinking of. And before that, I always had a teaching career, always. And when I left academia, I had one requirement for a job. I have lots, but the main one was I had. So, it's a little bit about me, and today I'm going to talk to you about the longest title in the history of PyTexas being. But we're going to talk about what experienced developers find hard while learning Python. And you might be saying, wait, yeah, but Python's easy. Okay, so in addition to I have been using Python since 2007. I am the example person for my book talk because I used Python at such a shallow level up until about 3 years ago. Math is hard, 14 years
of using Python, and I thought I was great at it. And I didn't know what a decorator was, and I had never heard of list comprehensions, and dictionaries were mystifying. Okay, so I was using it at such a shallow level that I thought I was really good at it. Okay, so as we move through this presentation, think about that. Now, what drives me, what makes me do my job, is that aha moment when somebody says, I get it, I understand. Okay, I don't care how many bugs you all fix in your code, it will never, ever, ever match that high I get when somebody understands something. So I hope that you all get those aha moments today. So what we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a little bit of the true science behind learning, just a little bit. And if you think you're going to see Bloom's taxonomy, you won't. It's okay. We're going to talk about what's challenging about learning Python, especially given that we're all taught that it's so super easy to learn. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do about it, what we as a community can do about it. But you know what this talk isn't? I am not going to teach you Python today. Okay? I am not. I'd love to, but I'm not. Okay? We're also not going to have a language wars to disparage other languages or to glorify Python. Because languages, they're tools in a toolkit. I happen to love Python, but it doesn't work for everything I want it to work for. Okay? But we're also not going to dive into the problems with Python as a language. That's just not what this talk is about. Now, having said that, is anybody here a C++ developer? I apologize to each and every one of you at the beginning of this presentation. And the reason is because I'm going to do a lot of, okay, in C++ this. And the reason that I do although I secretly do, it's because in my job, I see a lot of people who come in with other languages, and C++ is a big one. And they're being told, okay, partially because it's what I teach in training, okay, but also because it's one of our major languages at Bloomberg. And sometimes they come in and they'll sit down and they give me the ideas for this talk. So I'm not trying to be mean to C++ developers. You can insert any language you hate when I'm saying C++. I don't hate C++. It's just not really my good friend. So if that's what this talk isn't, what is this talk? I'm really hoping that I can shine a bit of a light on an area of Python development that doesn't get a lot of joy. Of people who are maybe some of you sitting here in this room who are like, oh my gosh, I'm learning Python. And guess what? It's a little bit harder than I thought. And I'm struggling, and I'm afraid to reach out to people. Okay. So I just want to give a little bit of idea, and also through talking to each of you, maybe brainstorm about how we can kind of, make this easier for people. So let's define what I mean by an experienced developer. I hear this all the time. In my job, I usually teach entry-level hires, so people who are right out of college. And they always ask me, Heather, when do I become senior? And I'm like, how long is a piece of string? Like, developer for the purposes of this talk. So they're not new to programming. They've programmed in something. Okay? C, C++, Java, JavaScript, Ruby, Go, pick your poison. But they are new to Python. They're actively trying to learn Python. They might be a professional
engineer or on the path to becoming one. That's not a requirement. But it does not imply that they have a formal computer science background. Okay, I believe really strongly that good programmers, good developers, good engineers come from wherever they come from. You know, that might be bootcamp, that might be formal computer science. Just because my background is formal computer science doesn't sort of make that. Okay, so no opinions about that. Okay, so how do we learn? How do we learn? It really boils down to this. Experts in anything recognize, and beginners. Okay, so what do I mean by that? In just a second, I'm going to press the button on my laptop that's going to show you some code. Alright? If you were here for the tutorials yesterday, no, this is not the same code as basic code. That's coming up on the other side. What I want each of you to do in the room, I'm going to give you just a few seconds to have a look at this code. And I want you to just shout out, as loud as you can, what you think this code does. Now, before I show it to you, please don't feel under the gun. I know I'm putting an artificial time limit on here, but it's to purposes of my talk. Okay? If you don't get the right answer, I don't care. It's fine. I still love you. Everybody ready? Ready? 3, 2, 1.
Sort.
Oh my God. So what kind of sorting? Oh, sort. Okay, yeah. You know what? If you didn't get it, I have some little drop generator. And you know what really tripped me up that last line?
right? Because it's very, very Pythonic to swap in place. Isn't that magical? No temporary variable. Yay. Okay, so this is a sorting algorithm. If you didn't get there right away, no problem. If you got one right away, it's because you know it from another language. It's because you already know what sort looks like, maybe in C++, maybe in Java, maybe in some other language. You did not have to reason about that code. Okay, somebody who is a little bit closer to the beginner side of things, or someone like me that does really have to read code, okay, has to read each line in turn. And they have to say things like, oh, okay, so I have an array, and then we go, no, it's a list. Okay, cool. I have a list, and it's got numbers in it. All right, some of the numbers are negative. Then I'm getting the length of it, and then there's a couple of for loops, and it seems to be iterating over the same thing. And as you're reasoning through this code as a beginner, you still don't know the joy. And the joy is that last line, because that's really what's doing the work of doing the sort. Okay, so once you get better at all of this, or if I showed you code that was just more familiar to you, experts recognize. And this, my friends, is a bad thing when you're trying to learn a new language, because the reason that you recognize is because the languages that preceded it taught you how to recognize it in that language. Okay, now, also, if you are a super experienced Python developer, this code makes you throw up a little in your mouth, okay? It's not very Pythonic, okay? That's all right. For today, it's not supposed to be. Okay, so let me give you a scenario, okay? And this scenario is going to follow us through the rest of this talk. Okay, so why are we here? So some person, let's call them a manager, says, we have a problem that needs to be solved and we need a Python developer stat, but we don't have one. Okay, and so the software engineer goes, okay, cool, I'm gonna fly in and save the day. I'm gonna solve your problem, and oh yeah, I have to learn Python to do it. It's okay. Python's easy. Okay, so their main focus is on solving the problem. So they write some code, and it works. It solves the problem. It's syntactically correct. And they go through a code review with a senior Python developer. I don't know why that person didn't just write the code, but it's my story, okay? And they go, oh, this code is fine. It works.
And before they know it, their code is unrecognizable because the senior developer has made it Pythonic. And our hero who swooped in to save the day is angry because they're like, well, I know my job, blah, blah, blah. And how do we make this easier for them? Because they basically have to go back to the drawing board. So that's kind of what we're here for. So the TLDR for this whole talk, and I hope that I won't lose you after this, because there's more. Okay, ready for this? Python is not C or C++ or Java or JavaScript, and I could go on, okay? Insert anything you want. And that's really the heart of what we're talking about here today, is that Python is different. It's different than any language I've written before. Now, I've heard from somebody that JavaScript and Python are getting more and more indistinguishable. I think it's lies, okay? But it's nothing like any language that I've ever had to learn before. That's both its power, but also sometimes when you're trying to learn it, its limitation. So let's dig in a little bit. First of all, I want to take a nod to what Mason did teach us yesterday. I consider these, among others, Python power moves. And we're going to come back to that term in a second. Okay, the stuff that makes Python super awesome, but also different. Decorators, comprehensions, generators, and slicing. Slicing is magical. Okay, so those are the things we're really going to come back to. There's more. There's more. Okay, now, this is where my talk and Mason's, if you weren't here yesterday, you get a little bit of code that Mason also wrote. So here, on the left-hand side of this slide, let me check. Yes, left. Okay. On the left-hand side of this slide, we have code that is just going to square a number if it's even. Okay, it's not doing anything special. I doubt this exists in production. Okay, but it is not very Pythonic. It works. It's syntactically correct. And those of you who maybe don't know Python as well, you can read. The two pieces of code are functionally equivalent. They do exactly the same thing. Somebody who is more well-versed in Python looks at the right-hand side and feels glorious. Okay. Somebody new to Python, and these words have actually been said to me before by a trainee learning Python for the first time. The first question was, is that just syntactic sugar? And I'm like, not really. And then the second was, you can't tell me that this side is easier to read than this side. And I said, but it is, and it's all about experience. So here's how I explained it to that trainee. I said, if we look at the start on this side, we have to read down until we get to the part that does something, which is really line 6, right? We have to read all of the code before that, when really I care what happens first. So when we read the list comprehension side, we read it like we would read a sentence. So here's how I would read that. I would say, we're going to take some value and square it for that value in some sort of set of values. Read it like a sentence. All of a sudden, you understand it immediately. Immediately. You don't have to wait to find out what the beautiful thing that the square brackets makes it to a list comprehension versus parentheses, which would make it a generator versus, on and on and on. That's a little, and say, just read it like you would a sentence. It makes sense right away. And you just have created a convert. So this is reason number 1. Python code is not the same thing as Pythonic code, idiomatic code. So you can write really correct Python code that is not Pythonic. And I did it for well over a decade. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that understanding these Pythonic idioms, these power moves, Python code is absolutely not like any other language's concepts or idioms. So I got this question fairly recently from
And again, sorry, C++ people, but she was a C++ developer. She was looking at a particular slide in one of our slide decks that was explaining how to pass a parameter. And the first thing that we did is show did not work the way that she expected. So the question she asked me, and it really was the AB problem because this was not the question she wanted answered, is Python passed by value or passed by reference? And my answer was neither. And she looked at me and she's like, what? I'm like, it's passed by assignment. And she's like, no, Heather. It has to be one of the two. I'm like, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. And I said, why? And she's like, well, in C++, and I put my hand up, I'm like, Python. And so she's like, well, what does pass by assignment mean? And I took out a piece of paper and I drew a diagram for her with arrows. Oh, but at the end, she had that aha moment. And then she said, that's weird. So her first reaction was to question this because her mental model of programming languages says it's passed by value, exclusive or passed by reference, okay? It can't be both and it can't be neither, okay? Then she was frustrated because the mental model that she had already built for herself didn't really help her anymore. Then she was angry and didn't want to learn Python. It was sort of like the stages of grief, if I'm honest with you. Okay, while she kind of gave up her kind of understanding of the world. So reason number 3 is that Python is easy. And you're like, wait, if Python is easy, why do people struggle with it? Well, my friends, it's because Python is too easy. Okay, so let's go to Theodore Roosevelt for a second. Nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, and difficulty. Know this as no pain, no gain. Okay. And this really does come to programming, is that Python has this underlying simplicity that can be frustrating and that is in order to be worth their time to learn. Okay, and that is hard to get over. Like, we're all laughing a little bit because it is kind of funny, but it's funny because it's true. And when we help people get over the idea that, no, it really is that simple, you know, then they sort of ease into the world of Python a little bit more easily. Okay, so reason number 4 they find it hard is that Python by design does not give a toss about memory. Nobody talks about pointers in Python, thank goodness. Okay, nobody shows you the example of putting 2 lists side by side and having them smash into each other's memories. A lot of the trainees that I teach that learn Python first don't even know that Stack Overflow is not just a clever name for the website. Okay. But the reality of why we don't care in Python is that whatever interpreter you use may use memory differently. And so we don't have to or want to put effort into learning the memory model because it's going to be different. Where when you learn it for C or C++, you've got it for your life. For your life. So for developers like C++ or C developers who have been taught that they must care deeply about memory management, saying, no, don't worry, is sort of frustrating to them. So reason number 5, and now I'm looking at Andy in my hype squad. Python needs lots and lots of testing. Lots and lots of testing. It's like any other interpreted language. And the reason that interpreted languages need lots of testing is because we don't have a compiler, or we do, but let's put a star beside the one that we've got, okay, to catch these errors before it hits runtime. Okay, we don't have that flexibility. Okay, and so we don't usually see all of the errors until we follow all of the different paths through the code. And that is best done by testing. Okay, yay, I got it right, yay. This means that in addition to learning the language and learning the idiomatic parts of it, now we expect you to learn a testing framework as well. And I'm going to make Andy even happier just a little bit later in this. Okay.
And my final reason to talk about today is that Python is all about knowing libraries. Okay, so there's a piece of code that is waiting for me to refactor it back at the office right now. It's gonna wait a bunch longer because I'm not looking forward to it. It was written by somebody who was deep in C++ world and new to Python. And so there's no return statements. I have sys exit 0 everywhere. And I have about 300 lines of code that argparser could do for you. Okay, now the reason, and if you're not familiar with argparser, it's a library for parsing arguments. Okay, it's really fancy, I love it. But being really good at Python is really not about writing more code. It's about saying to yourself, what library could do this for me? Okay, and that's true of all of the Python libraries that exist, but also the third-party libraries that people are always writing. Okay, oh, and if you tell an experienced developer that, they're like, no, I want to roll my own. And you're like, but it will break. Then they get mad at you. Okay, so what now? Our hero is feeling kind of sad. They have a bit of a cloud above them. They're not sure what to do. They're thinking of changing careers, okay? Or maybe going back someplace that maybe C++ or whatever language is more the norm. So what can we do to help them? So technique one is a little bit strange. It's know when to quit. I mean, know when to give up on them, which is terrible. We don't want to give up on people. But let me explain, and this is a little bit more about how we learn, okay? When we learn, we go through the 4 stages that you see here on the slide. And when people start out, they're in this area called unconscious incompetence. It means they don't know what they don't know, and they're not convinced that it's going to solve whatever problem. So our hero is like, they told me to write Python, but really? Okay, so when you're in that level of unconscious incompetence, it's really hard to teach you, really hard. We need to move our hero into the second stage, conscious incompetence, which means that you still don't know what you don't know, but you're convinced it's going to solve the problem. That might be internally motivated or externally motivated, depending on who you are. Okay, when we can move that person into that conscious incompetence, then we have a hope of some of my other techniques landing with them. But until they get out of the headspace that they don't want to do this, it's probably better to give them a little more time. Okay, I'm calling it give up on them. Now, the other 2 aren't really important to the discussion, but conscious competence is where you're like, okay, I kind of get some of this. I'm starting to get to Heather in, say, 2010, 2011, where I can work with the code, but I haven't moved yet to unconscious competence, where I do things like write a list comprehension without first writing the for loop, okay, where I write idiomatic code automatically. And true story, I still do that, because to me, sometimes separating solving the problem and writing the code to solve the problem, those are 2 different ways of thinking for me. Okay, so technique 2 is we need to move away from other languages. And I separate this into 2 parts. The first one is, if you're the trainer or the teacher, is that you have to move people away from, okay, yeah, but what is that in Java or C or C++? Because chances are it doesn't exist. Okay, I can't think of something like a list comprehension in other languages. If you know of them, come talk to me later and we'll talk about it. What we should focus on as teachers is what is different about the language rather than what's the same. So avoid trying to say, well, in C++ this works like this. Okay, now if you're a developer, I really want you to understand that not all languages are the same, and that learning one doesn't mean you learn them all. Okay, even within paradigms like functional languages. Okay, I want you to keep an open mind about every single language that you learn and try to see it for adding another tool to your toolkit that is going to be able to solve a problem for you later. Okay, that is going to help you learn. So technique number 3 is focused on the trainers again. Consider what tools you have for teaching and use the right ones for the right level of learner. So starting at the bottom here, demos and lectures are super awesome for early, like people who are learning a whole thing from scratch. Okay, so as a trainer, their first programming language. Okay, demos and lectures are awesome. They want to see somebody work with the language. And in fact, when I was a professor, I used to teach freshmen intro to programming.
and I would live code in front of them, and I would do it badly because guess what? Live coding is hard, right? And I did it to show them that even experienced developers make mistakes, and it's more valuable on how you get out of it than not making mistakes anymore. But as we move up towards the top of this list here, we get into the place that really experienced developers find themselves. Labs and pair programming. Any experienced developer just wants to write the code. Okay, so give them a lab, hopefully a staged lab, that can walk them through increasingly difficult concepts. Okay, pair programming is an amazing thing, especially if you compare somebody more experienced with somebody less experienced. My job is way easier when people pair program. I answer way fewer questions. It's a little sadder, but it's easier. One of the things that I would tell you, though, is that when you're teaching an experienced developer, some of the things that we give new developers to help them learn are just going to be frustrating. If I asked any single one of you in this room to grab a piece of paper and do a code trace, you'd probably go, what? But for a new developer, that's a really important thing. Okay, so Andy. Consider test-driven development for experienced developers who are trying to learn Python. Okay, I knew you'd be happy. So testing is a huge part of Python development, and you can ease people into the language of Python a little bit easier because something like PyTest is really quite intuitive. It doesn't use a lot of the power moves that I mentioned before, at least not at its heart. And so you can get people writing good, syntactically correct, and even kind of idiomatic code really quickly if you get them writing tests first. Okay, so test-driven development is a really, really important part, I think, of teaching experienced developers. Okay, so why did you listen to this whole talk, and what do I want you to get away with or walk away with? Is that it's really up to all of us who use Python regularly to make sure that everyone can use it, to really make it something that is inclusive for everybody, and not to scare away the people who consider Python a toy language that they don't need to learn. Okay. We need to teach experienced learners differently using a variety of tools and not just trying to attack the problem as we would for somebody who's new to development. As a developer, you need to keep your mind open to the different paradigms that are available to you in terms of programming. And you need to not judge a language, not fall for the hype that C++ gives us that Python is a toy development language. And as a code reviewer, and I had a really, really good talk with my colleague Oliver yesterday about this, how do we, as code reviewers, support Pythonic programming without getting experienced developers mad at us because they're used to writing good code that passes review immediately? All right, so I'm more than happy to take the questions that came in on Slido, and my experience tells me that please feel free to ask any of these questions by number, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. We have a few questions. Ooh. We have a few questions coming in on Slido, so let me start with that, and I will apologize to you guys. I forgot to remind you at the start of the talk, if you have questions, please toss them in Slido. If you don't have questions but want to vote on the ones that are in there, please check Slido for that as well. So while we're doing that, feel free to keep adding, and we'll talk for a few minutes here while they're getting set up. So first question, do you think it's harder for new programmers or experienced programmers to learn Python?
Both, but for different reasons. Experienced programmers, because they tend to depend far too much on what they already know, and new developers, because Python lacks a certain structure to it that helps them build the mental model of what programming languages are all really doing under the hood.
Okay, cool. What is a good resource if someone wants to kind of study, internalize Pythonic patterns? Where would you send someone?
I don't know if we're allowed to say like actual websites, but I love Real Python. If anybody is here from Real Python, I used it a lot because when I was prepping for my interview at Bloomberg, I didn't know what Pythonic meant. And there's a whole resource for that. I also think that things like HackerRank to a certain degree, like get actually writing code in it. Yeah.
Makes
No
sense.
books.
Okay, and we got time for one or two more. Do you have any favorite resource recommendations for devs coming to Python from other languages?
Real Python. I think just not trying to translate code. Don't try to take something you wrote in C++ and rewrite it in Python. You can, okay? But also look at other people's code. Other people's code is a really good way. I learned so much by looking at the code that we saw yesterday, not even gonna lie.
Awesome. Okay, and can you give an example of Python being too easy?
Duck typing. So when you begin using a variable in Python, you can make it whatever you want throughout its lifetime, and that can be a little frustrating to people. They're like, wait, that was an integer and now it's a string, why? And you're like, 'cause awesome. But duck typing can be something that once you get your head around it, it's too easy.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Last one, and then I'll hand it over to Josh for our next speaker. The list is changing under me, so let me try and read it before it moves again. I'm glad y'all are involved. That's awesome. How do you convince, we're going to stick with that. How do you convince experienced devs that third-party libraries are not dangerous or lazy?
So I don't, because my background is in information security. I think they can be dangerous. But I just say that the community is a pretty open one, and that I've never gotten a bad third-party library from Python.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again, Heather.
Thank you, everyone.